Greetings, YouTube. I'm going to try my street glasses and see if they have a little less glare. So I was thinking about elves. Someone had been talking about one of the forums making a list of all the elves there are, like in all fantasy forms of fiction. So they're building a very long list on that particular thread. And that doesn't really interest me. But it got me thinking, how many elven races do you want in your setting? Assuming you want elves. Anyone who doesn't want elves, I guess this video isn't for you. So I guess you can go look at one of my other gaming videos if you want. And for me, I think I would want 3. And by races, it's very loose in the sense that they could all interbreed with each other, but they've become somewhat specialized because they would have probably slightly different stat bonuses. I'm not positive. They could all just be exactly the same or almost exactly the same and have different cultural backgrounds. Now the big difference was that it would be night elves or drow or something like that, wild elves, and then a structured they divide between 2 different civilized groups. And civilized by I mean like city builders, think Tolkien. And they'd be the ones that are like all by themselves, like Tolkien elves, living out in the valleys or something with big cities, and they're isolationists. The wild elves living in the trees. I always like that vibe myself. Then you have the assimilationists who have assimilated themselves into the culture, mostly human culture, of the cities of the other races. It's very urban, very cosmopolitan. And you might, I don't know about the sea elves. I think I might actually would use like a template, like you could tack on to any of the others. You know what I mean? So you could have city building sea elves and hippie crunchy sea elves and maybe night elves that live in the underdark oceans, which I can't remember what they're called. Something like that. And that fills my need for elves. I don't have any half breeds. I still don't like half breeds. That's not my thing. But then again, you could be wanting elves that are more Fey-like. Then there could be as many elven breeds as there are trees and plants in the forest, and maybe even the elves themselves can't keep track of how many different varieties there are, and they could all have the same stats or just have a pool of different abilities that mix and match, and they're all very different from each other. Shoot. I saw a fairy race, Right Publishing, I think it might have been, that had a nice little customization feature. So you start with the base race, then you can go into different directions with different abilities, all built in the Pathfinder engine. So you could have a group of people all playing fairies and have them be very different. So you could probably have an entire group of elves and have them be very different, both either because they're significantly different, like night elves and the wild elves, or just culturally, like the wild elves and the more urban or the isolationist advanced elves. Now, you could probably have an argument among the elves, and the elves probably do, of which was the original elven race. Which was the original elf? And I think it would probably be the wild elves. And then the other ones broke off from then over time. But that's just my opinion. Maybe the city dwellers were the first ones, progenitors of some very structured god, and then the wild elves broke off because they felt stifled, and they went and created their own culture out there in the woods and decided they would bond with trees instead of building skyscrapers or what have you. They decided that mercantilism wasn't their thing, and they wanted to go hug some trees. So you obviously get some parallels between the politics of the modern era and things in the fantasy campaign. But I'm interested in hearing how many different varieties of elves do you think that any game that you want to run needs. Was it Dawnforge that had like the early elf? All the races were early. It was like the golden era, and the elves had not completely split off and become truly distinct. Pretty much, you had the day elves and the night elves, and I liked that the way it was set up. And there was Right Publishing did a fantasy Asia setting that deals with both China and Japan and a number of other of the South Asian nations, and I think they also have some influences from like India in there too. And they had a race which essentially are the yin yang. So like they're literally the give and take of each other. So this race, these two races that are intimately linked, and essentially it was their take on the day and the night elves and how they cannot be separated in any meaningful way, and yet they are completely different, which was interesting. I have to talk about that in the video one of these days. Rate Publishing has done some nice things with the races. I do love looking at race information. I think it's very entertaining. I enjoy the reading. So, tell me, how many different varieties of elves do you want? And do you think that there have been times when there have been too many? And I'm going to tell you right now, I think there have been times when there have been too many. Second edition AD&D had far too many varieties of elves. Third edition had fewer, and I still think there were too many varieties of elves. You didn't need that many varieties of elves. Not everything needs to be willowy and have pointed ears. So let's talk about